They mocked her scars. Then a Marine colonel stood up. The laughter was sharp, cutting through Sullivan's Café like a blade aimed directly at her. Sarah Mitchell kept her head down, fingers tightening around the coffee pot as the group of young executives at table 6 snickered, their eyes flicking between the jagged scars across her forearm and the dog tags hanging from her neck. One of them mimed slicing his own arm, and his friends burst into fresh giggles. Her breath hitched just for a second before she forced herself to keep moving. The familiar weight of shame pressed down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd been here before. The sideways glances, the whispered comments, the way conversations stopped when she walked by. At 27, Sarah had perfected the art of becoming invisible. Then, from the corner of the cafe, a chair scraped back hard against the worn wooden floor. She didn't know it yet, but in 30 seconds, her life would change because the man who stood up wasn't just any customer. He was Colonel James Harrison, decorated Marine officer with 3 tours in Afghanistan and a chest full of ribbons that told stories of their own. And he wasn't going to let this slide. Sarah had worked at Sullivan's Café for 2 years, serving coffee and sandwiches to regulars who barely noticed her. The morning shift, 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., 6 days a week. She knew their orders by heart: black coffee for the construction workers, vanilla latte extra foam for the real estate agent, decaf with 2 sugars for the elderly man who always sat by the window reading yesterday's newspaper. The scars on her forearm, a relic from a past she refused to talk about. 3 jagged lines that started just below her elbow and disappeared under the sleeve of her uniform. She'd tried covering them with makeup, long sleeves, even temporary tattoos, but nothing could hide what those marks represented. The dog tags around her neck, usually tucked beneath her apron, a silent tribute to brothers who never came home. She'd gotten good at deflecting questions. "Accident when I was younger," she'd say, or "just clumsy, I guess." People rarely pressed for details. They saw what they wanted to see: a damaged girl working a dead-end job, someone who'd probably made poor choices, someone forgettable. But what the executives didn't know was that someone in that cafe recognized the quiet dignity of a true Marine, someone who knew exactly how real those dog tags were, because he'd worn them too. Someone who understood that some scars aren't accidents, they're awards. And Colonel James Harrison had spent enough years in uniform to spot a fellow warrior, even when she was hiding behind a coffee pot and a forced smile. The laughter continued, growing louder and more cruel. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the small cafe watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she kept moving, kept serving, kept pretending that their mockery couldn't touch her. She had no idea that her pretending days were about to end. Sarah was used to the stares, the whispers, the way people either gawked at her scars or looked right through her like she was invisible. The jagged lines across her forearm told a story she'd buried deep, wrapped in layers of shame and survivor's guilt. Most days she could pretend they were just part of her, like freckles or a birthmark. But today was different. Today the laughter cut deeper. She'd been having nightmares again. 3 years since she'd left the Corps, and still the dreams came. Flashes of desert sand, the crack of sniper fire, the weight of a wounded Marine bleeding out in her arms. She'd wake up gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, her scars aching like phantom limbs. The executives at table 6 had been nursing their overpriced lattes for an hour, their voices growing louder with each cruel joke. Brad Thompson, lead sales manager at some tech startup, was the ringleader. Young, confident, the kind of guy who'd never missed a meal or worried about anything more serious than his stock options. "I bet she did it herself," Tyler whispered, not quite quietly enough. "For attention, you know. My ex-girlfriend used to—" "You got a problem, gentlemen?" The voice was low, controlled, but carried the unmistakable authority of command. It cut through the ambient noise of the cafe like a blade through silk. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Even the espresso machine seemed to quiet down. Every head in Sullivan's Café turned toward the corner table where the voice had originated. At the small round table by the window, an older man in marine dress blues stood slowly, deliberately. His steel-gray eyes were locked on the laughing executives with the kind of intensity that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Colonel James Harrison didn't look like someone you wanted to cross. 62 years old, ramrod straight posture that spoke of decades in uniform, hands that bore the calluses of a man who'd held rifles longer than most people held jobs. The ribbons on his chest caught the afternoon light filtering through Sullivan's front windows. Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device, Combat Action Ribbon, Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal with 4 stars. The name tape read Harrison, but the 3 younger Marines at his table had been calling him Sir for the past hour while they discussed their upcoming deployment. This was supposed to be a goodbye lunch, a quiet meal before the young warriors shipped out to places that would test everything they'd learned in training. Brad, the loudest of the executives, smirked and leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been held accountable for his words. "What, you her bodyguard or something, old man?" The temperature in the cafe seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to be anywhere but here. Colonel Harrison didn't blink. His gaze shifted deliberately from Brad's face to Sarah's forearm, then to the dog tags resting against her apron. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades in the Corps, of battles fought and brothers lost. "No," he said quietly, "but I know what those scars mean, and I know she earned them the same way I earned mine. If you believe no veteran should ever be treated this way, hit that like button right now, and stick around, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the soft hum of the industrial coffee machine, the distant traffic outside on Main Street, the collective intake of breath from the dozen customers watching this drama unfold. Even the kitchen had gone quiet. Mike the cook was standing in the pass-through window, spatula forgotten in his hand. Sarah's world had narrowed to this moment, this terrible, beautiful moment, when someone finally saw her for who she really was. Her hands trembled as she gripped the coffee pot, knuckles white against the black handle. Tyler, another executive in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The easy confidence was starting to crack. "Look, you were just what?" The voice came from across the cafe, near the counter where the newspapers were stacked. A younger Marine, maybe 25, his left sleeve pinned neatly where his arm should have been. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams had been reading the sports section, minding his own business until he heard the laughter. He stood slowly, deliberately, his prosthetic visible beneath the pinned sleeve. "Laughing at her scars means you're laughing at mine, too." His voice carried the steady confidence of someone who'd faced down insurgents in Fallujah and lived to tell about it. From across the cafe, another voice joined the chorus. And mine. A female Marine with burn scars tracing the left side of her jawline rose to her feet, her expression deadly serious. Gunnery Sergeant Lisa Chen had been enjoying a rare day off, but that was over now. The keloid tissue on her neck told its own story of an IED blast outside Kandahar. The transformation was almost surreal. One by one, every service member in Sullivan's Café stood. It was like watching an invisible army materialize from the civilian crowd. An Army Ranger with a prosthetic leg from the table by the door. A Navy corpsman with a cane leaning against his chair. An Air Force pilot whose hands bore the telltale burn marks of emergency ejection procedures. A Coast Guard petty officer with shrapnel scars across his forearms. They didn't coordinate it, didn't plan it. It just happened, the way military training kicks in during crisis. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The message was crystal clear. You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. For 2 years, she'd hidden in plain sight, serving coffee to people who saw her as broken, damaged, less than whole. She'd convinced herself that she was alone, that no one would understand, that the uniform was behind her forever. But these warriors, they saw her. They recognized the invisible uniform she wore, the unspoken bond that connected them all across branches and decades and deployment zones, the brotherhood that transcended everything else. Chase, the third executive, had gone pale as paper. He looked around at the sea of hardened faces, at the scars and missing limbs and purple hearts, and suddenly his marketing degree felt very, very small. "Look, man, we didn't mean anything by it. We were just, you think scars are funny?" Colonel Harrison's voice was colder than an Afghan winter. "Then let me tell you what hers really mean." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The coffee pot in her hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. No one knew. No one could know. She'd buried that night so deep, wrapped it in layers of shame and survivor's guilt, and the kind of silence that eats you alive from the inside. She'd never told anyone the whole story. Not the VA counselor with her kind eyes and useless platitudes. Not her mother, who still asked when she was going to get back to normal. Not even Father Murphy at St. Catherine's, though he'd tried during those long Sunday confessions where she'd sit in the dark wooden booth and struggle to find words for things that had no words. But Colonel Harrison wasn't stopping. He was going to tell them. All of them. And Sarah realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time. "That scar?" He nodded toward Sarah's forearm, his voice carrying across the silent cafe like a prayer. "That's from razor wire. Taliban compound, Helmand Province, September 15th, 2021. She tore through it, dragging 2 wounded Marines to cover while her fire team got lit up by sniper fire from 3 different positions." The cafe fell into the kind of stunned silence that follows lightning strikes. Sarah's breath caught, not in shame this time, but in something else. Something that felt like recognition, like coming home after a long journey through enemy territory. "They were pinned down for 6 hours," Colonel Harrison continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Temperature was 118 degrees. No water, limited ammo. Medevac couldn't get in because of the crossfire. 2 Marines bleeding out, and she kept them alive with nothing but her field medical training and sheer force of will. Sarah found her voice, and when she spoke, it was steady and strong and proud. Their names were Corporal Danny Morrison from Toledo, Ohio, and Lance Corporal Mike Chen from San Francisco. Danny was 19. Mike had just turned 21 the week before, and I'd do it again. She hadn't spoken their names aloud in 3 years. Hadn't wanted the pity, the whispers, the way people looked at her like she was either a hero or a victim. Never just human. But standing there, surrounded by people who understood, she felt something she hadn't felt since she'd turned in her rifle and walked away from the only life that had ever made sense. Pride. The executive stared at her with a mixture of awe and horror and something that might have been respect. Tyler's mouth hung open slightly. Chase was studying his expensive shoes like they held the secrets of the universe. Brad, the ringleader, looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. We didn't know," he stammered, all his corporate confidence evaporating like steam. "No," Colonel Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You didn't. Because you never bothered to ask. You saw scars and assumed damage. You saw a young woman working in a cafe and assumed failure. You never saw the Marine." Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of invisible dress blues settling around her like armor. For the first time in 3 years, she remembered who she was. The Marines didn't cheer. They didn't clap or make a show of it or turn it into some kind of patriotic display. They simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that spoke louder than any parade, any ceremony, any medal presentation. It was the nod that said, "I see you. I know you. You're not alone." Then they sat back down, returning to their coffee and their conversations, but the respect lingered in the air like incense, thick and unmistakable and sacred. Sarah turned back to the coffee pot, but this time she didn't hide her scars. She rolled up her sleeves slowly, deliberately, letting the afternoon light stream through Sullivan's front windows and catch the jagged lines that mapped her courage across her forearm. For the first time in 3 years, she wore them like what they actually were, Medals of honor earned in blood and brotherhood, and the kind of love that makes you throw yourself between bullets and the people you've sworn to protect. The transformation was visible, physical. Her posture straightened, her chin lifted. The apologetic hunch in her shoulders disappeared, replaced by the bearing of a United States Marine. The dog tags around her neck caught the light as she moved, no longer hidden beneath her apron, but displayed with quiet pride. Colonel Harrison caught her eye as she approached his table with the coffee pot, her steps now carrying the confident stride of someone who'd marched through basic training at Paris Island and emerged as one of the few and the proud. "You ever think about coming to the Marine Corps League meetings, Staff Sergeant?" he asked quietly, using her rank for the first time. "We meet every Thursday evening at 7 o'clock at the VFW Hall on Elm Street. Bunch of old Marines telling stories and pretending we're not getting soft." Sarah smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. It started small, just a quirk at the corner of her mouth, then spread across her face like sunrise breaking over a desert horizon. "You know what, sir? I think I'd like that very much." The executives at Table 6 finished their lunch in complete silence. They ate their overpriced sandwiches and drank their cooling lattes without another word, stealing glances at Sarah as she moved through the cafe with newfound confidence. When Brad asked for the check, his voice was barely above a whisper. They left a $50 tip on a $30 bill, not out of generosity, but out of guilt, and the desperate hope that money could somehow erase the memory of their cruelty. When they walked out of Sullivan's Café, they didn't make eye contact with anyone. They'd learned something that day about respect, about service, about the price of freedom and the people who pay it. But more importantly, Sarah had learned something too. She'd learned that healing doesn't happen in hiding. That dignity isn't something you lose when you get wounded. It's something you choose to carry. And that sometimes, the most important battle you'll ever fight isn't against an enemy in some foreign desert. Sometimes it's the battle for your own self-worth. Your own right to take up space in the world, your own permission to be proud of the scars that prove you stood in the gap when it mattered most. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell walked into the VFW Hall on Elm Street, wearing her dress blues for the first time in 3 years. The uniform still fit perfectly, though the ribbons on her chest told a story she was finally ready to share with the world. Combat Action Ribbon, Purple Heart, Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal with Combat V. The VFW Hall smelled like coffee and Old Spice and the kind of institutional cleaning solution that brought back memories of barracks inspections. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, American flag hanging from a pole in the corner, faded photographs of Marines from every era lining the wood-paneled walls. Colonel Harrison stood at the podium addressing a room full of veterans from every branch of service, grizzled sergeants and baby-faced corporals, helicopter pilots and tank drivers, nurses and riflemen and logistics specialists who'd kept the whole machine running. When he saw Sarah in the doorway, her dress blues immaculate and her bearing proud, he smiled and gestured for her to join them. "Before we continue with tonight's business," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I'd like to introduce someone special. This is Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, recently returned from a 3-year leave of absence. Some of you might know her from Sullivan's Café, but tonight you're seeing her as she really is, one of the finest Marines I've ever had the honor to serve alongside." The room erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but the thunderous recognition of one warrior honoring another. Sarah walked to the front of the room, past faces that showed every emotion from pride to understanding to the kind of respect that can't be faked or bought or earned through anything but service. She took her seat among her fellow Marines, her scars visible, her dog tags catching the fluorescent light, her head held high with the kind of dignity that comes from finally accepting who you are and what you've done and why it matters. The business meeting continued, discussions about the upcoming Veterans Day parade, fundraising for a local family whose Marine son had been wounded in Syria, plans for a volunteer project at the VA hospital. But Sarah barely heard the words. She was thinking about the executives who had mocked her, about the 3 years she'd spent hiding, about Danny Morrison and Mike Chen and the night in Helmand Province that had changed everything. Most of all, she was thinking about the words Colonel Harrison had spoken that day in the cafe. I know what those scars mean. Now she knew too. They weren't marks of weakness or reminders of trauma or evidence of poor life choices. They were proof. Proof that she'd stood in the gap when it mattered. Proof that she'd chosen courage over comfort. Proof that some things are worth bleeding for. After the meeting, as the veterans filed out into the cool evening air, Sarah lingered in the parking lot. Colonel Harrison approached her, his expression serious but kind. "How does it feel?" he asked. Sarah looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, then back at the VFW hall where the lights were being turned off one by one. "Like coming home, sir," she said, "like finally coming home." The next morning, Sarah reported to work at Sullivan's Café wearing her uniform sleeves rolled up, her scars visible, her dog tags displayed with pride. When customers asked about them, and they did ask, drawn by curiosity and respect rather than mockery, she told them the truth. She told them about Danny and Mike, about Helmand Province and razor wire and the 6 longest hours of her life, about what it means to be a Marine, what it costs to earn the title, why some prices are worth paying. The executives never came back to Sullivan's Café, but their absence was a gift rather than a loss. Word travels fast in small communities, and the story of what happened that day became the kind of tale that gets passed down, that changes hearts and minds one conversation at a time. Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "I know what that means." Sometimes that's enough to change everything. If this story touched you, hit that like button and drop a Semper Fi in the comments below, because every veteran deserves to be seen, to be honored, and to know that their service and their scars matter. Semper Fidelis.